So I just want to thank you guys, and I hope you're all safe now with this craziness that's going on. I apologize for my mustache slash goatee. That's all I had. And one thing about the presentation, I put a few QR codes in the presentation, so keep your phone ready so you can just scan them during the presentation, and then I'm gonna link you to a different website. Okay? So let's start. And again, thank you. Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about my textual workflow in Mari. I'm going to be discussing my Leviathan Sentinel project. Before we begin, I just want to thank a few people. First of all, I just want to thank David Letondor. He was the guy responsible for the model of Leviathan. So he provided the model, and I was responsible for the UVs, textures, and look dev. So this project was created for my advanced texturing course at Think Online a couple of years ago. And if you want to know more about the school and the course, you can access this website down here. And I also want to thank Foundry for inviting me to do this presentation, this webinar today. And you know, I'm really happy to be here and sharing with you this workflow. So let's jump right into it. Before we begin with the workflow per se, I just want to talk a little bit about the role of a texture artist. And I feel like as texture artists, we have the great opportunity in our hands when we have an asset. It doesn't matter if you're working in your own project or if you're working in a production. I feel like we have the opportunity to tell a story through our textures. Any detail that you add, any scratch that you add to your hovercraft, to your robot, or any scar that you add to your character, it's a story that you're telling, right? And that's something that I keep telling my students, and I keep telling people that ask me questions online is like, don't worry too much about the technical aspect of things, and try to focus a bit more on the fundamentals. You know, like how can you look at real life materials and textures, and how can you tell a story with that? You know, and that's something that I think can help you a lot with any project you have. You know, think about storytelling and how to tell a good story. So this presentation, I broke down this presentation into two parts. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an overview of this project, like all the steps that I went through to finish Leviathan for my course. And then after this presentation, all the slides that I'm going to show you, I'm going to go to Mari and then show you the file. And I'm going to show you two different workflows. I'm going to show you the layer workflow that I used. And then I also going to show how I translated the layer workflow into a node-based workflow. Okay, so this is just a timeline. It doesn't necessarily follow this exactly. You know, like actually, I would say that this first stage here is pretty accurate. That's pretty much what happens, how it goes. But then this area here, it's a bit mixed up. Like you don't need to develop these masks before this. It depends a lot on the project, but we're going to discuss this a bit more later on. So this is the final render of Leviathan. This is a few close-ups. And let's talk about the prep stage. The prep stage is when I like to start searching for references, and I think about the textures in my library. This is a very important step, and you probably heard this already. If you're working on any project, doesn't matter if it's texturing, if it's sculpting or modeling, you know, references are essential for a good, realistic, if you want to achieve a realistic project. And that's the first step to me, especially for this asset, because I didn't have a concept art. So I kind of had to design the look of it from scratch. So I used the PureRef app. It's not an app, it's a software you can download on this website. PureRef is great because it's like a mood board, and you can drag all these images and you can add this, lettering here. And yeah, you should definitely use it if you want to, create mood boards and things like that. So I added a few real life references. These are some suits that I found online. My main reference was the Pacific Rim Pacific Rim white suit. So this suit was my main inspiration for Leviathan. I loved the scratches, and I found so many good references online for like the different damage states. I also had some different ones here for different materials. Like one thing with references is you have to be careful to not have way too much, because sometimes you can get lost. What I usually do, I have like one, which is like my main reference, and then I have some secondary ones. And I also like to have a CG render as my inspiration for the level of detail that I want to achieve. In this case, I had Chappie here, and I really liked the level of detail that he achieved with his textures on this asset. So I just put it here as an inspiration for me. So after I found all my references. It's time to unwrap I unwrapped Leviathan, and this is just like a little graph that I put together, because it's funny, because a lot of people, when we talk about UVs, when they're making UVs for an asset that has like 5 UDIMs or less, they say, oh no, it's super relaxing. But as soon as they work on an asset that have like 50 or more UDIMs, they know how annoying, and it's a nightmare. Like if you do a proper layout of an asset that has all these UDIMs, it's going to be a headache. But UVs are one of those things that it can be really annoying, but it's also like one of the most important things to keep in mind, because if you spend some time here, you're going to save a lot of time later on. And here on the side, I put a few QR codes along this presentation. So in this case, I wrote a few articles and tutorials in the past about UVs. So if you scan this code here with your phone, you're just going to link you to my website, so you can take a look on those articles later on if you want. But I go more in depth about UVs and how to lay them down and think about resolution and how to optimize them. But again, really important. This is just a breakdown of my UV set, my UDIMs for Leviathan. That's how I broke down into materials. A lot of people ask me like if this is like the final layout, if I ever change this. I mean, especially in production, this changes a lot. In this case, like if you look at the final render, I had these brass pieces, these golden pieces here that I didn't think about them in the beginning when I was making my UVs. So they're not even here. So what I had to do, I had to manually select them, those pieces, and then make them like that. So I had to create some isolation masks later on, which is fine. But as long as you have organized UDIMs, it's easy enough for you to select them. Because if you have automatic UVs layouts, it would be a nightmare for you to select them. So this is something that, especially if you're working in a company, it's really considerate for you to organize the UVs properly and make sure that the texture artists have a good layout to work with. So after we have our UVs, we're going to start baking our maps. This is another important thing. Like, having good UVs will also help you having good baked maps, because it would depend a lot on the UVs and the resolution you have. So keep that in mind. And this is just a few maps that I used for Leviathan. I just put I had curvatures from ZBrush, from the extension pack in Mari, from the ambient occlusion built in Mari, and maps from Substance. I just, use whatever I have in hands to bake these maps. And they're really important because they're going to help me drive a lot of the masks, like the wear masks that we have on the edges. And if you want to add dust to the crevices. So these maps are extremely important. So after I have all this together, I have my UVs ready, I have my maps baked, it's time to assemble my scene. And if you know me, if you know my work, if you've seen my videos before, you probably know how obsessive I am with organization. And this is something that a lot of people say, like, oh, but I'm not organized, I'm not, I don't have OCD like you do. How do you want me to organize my things like that? And honestly, it doesn't have to be like crazy organized. Like, you don't have to color code everything, but just by keeping naming conventions and things consistent, it's going to help you a lot down the road. And there's one method that I talk about a lot is the mise en place method. That I didn't create the method. I just put a fancy name into it. It's just a matter of like organizing everything before you start texturing. And I talk extensively about this workflow in a video. So I just put this QR code here. So if you want to watch later. In the past, even when I created this project a couple years ago, I used layers. And for the longest time, since I started my career, I was using layers quite a lot. But in for the past year or so, I've been using nodes quite a lot, the node graph in Mari, and I just fell in love with it. To me, it's like you should use whatever you feel comfortable. If you can, work and deliver good work, it doesn't really matter what you use. But I would highly recommend you to take a look at the node graph and see if you can get used to it, because it's extremely powerful and it's super modular. If you're working on a team, like, it's super easy for you to share with other artists. But one thing I would say is, when you start assembling your texturing scene in Mari, I would choose your workflow. If you start working with layers, stick with it until the end. Because if you try to switch to nodes in the middle of the project, you're gonna have a crazy headache. And same thing with nodes. If you start working with nodes, keep using nodes until the end. And this is an example here. If a file that is start with nodes, you can keep it quite tidy and organized, especially now with the geo channels in Mari 4.6. It's super nice and it's easy for you to keep organized. But this is a case where I started with layers and then I looked at my node graph. This is how it looks like. It's going to be a nightmare. So choose the workflow that you want before it's too late. You can still organize this, but trust me, it's going to be a nightmare. But later I'm going to talk a little bit about the two workflows in the end of this presentation, and then you can understand a bit better. Okay, so after we assemble the file, we're ready to start working. There's a stage where I start developing my masks. In this case, again, this is going to depend a lot on the project, but for Leviathan, I started developing my damage masks and dust and dirt and etc. I have here you should talk to your look dev artist. In this case, I was my own look dev artist, so I talked to myself and I said, "Hey, what's up? What do you need?" And I'm like, "Oh, I might need some, damage aware, edge wear mask and some dust and dirt." And to me, with these masks, I had the opportunity to start telling a story with the details. That's what we talked about, right? Storytelling. I tried to mimic the main details that I saw on that suit that I talked about. And one thing that I failed a lot in the beginning when I started creating this mask was that I was relying too much on my edge, my curvature masks that I had, the curvature that gave me access to all these edges. And I was like, oh man, this looks awesome. Look at all these edges. I want to, make them all, I want to have wear on every single edge. It's going to look super cool. But then I got some feedback from Justin, who was helping me at the time. And he's like, dude, like, just look at the reference. And when you look at the reference, when you actually look at it, you see that it's not every edge that is worn, like it's just a few areas. You have some main areas of interest, and then the rest you have some relief. And that's something really important that I even put it here. So you have to be careful and make sure to break away from proceduralism. Nowadays we have many tools that make it easier for us to create these masks and these damage masks, but the most important thing is for you to attain to realism and make sure that you create something that feels real instead of just like thinking that looks cool, So that's something that it really took me some time to develop that. In the end, you can see here, I don't have every single edge worn anymore. I only have like some main areas of interest and then some edges that are broken. And yeah, so this map was the one that took me the longest to edit and to paint, and I kept editing until the end. And that's another thing. Like it doesn't. I'm not saying that you have to finish it and be done with it. You can always go back and adjust as you go along. And this other two masks were a bit simpler, but they also like helped a lot to bring the look in the end. So after I'm done with my masks, I finally started to develop my main channels, my main maps. So I'm talking about my diffuse or color, spec maps, gloss, bump. Again, it would depend a lot on the asset that you're working on. But for Leviathan, I started with broad strokes, keeping it simple as much as possible. I had, thinking about color breakup, and adding breakup to every single map so it doesn't look flat, and adding some extra projections, like some extra scratches and things like that. So this is how they look like in the end: diffuse, spec, glossiness, and bump. And so I spent more time on my masks for this asset specifically because most of it was most of the look came from the spec and gloss maps because it was mainly metals, and I also had some extra maps in the end. These maps they help a lot the look dev artist, in this case myself, to adjust a few things in the shader side if needed. So this is an example of two types of masks. You can have some isolation masks that isolate some specific areas of your model. Isolate. Some people might have a material ID that have different colors for each material, or black and white maps, such as this one. It would depend a lot on your preference, on the preference of the shader artist. And there's also RGB masks that you can create. The good thing about RGB masks is that you can store three types of maps into one single channel. If you scan this QR code, there's an article that I wrote about RGB masks and how to create them. But it's pretty useful. And okay, so after creating all these maps, it's time to start testing. I started testing my maps in V-Ray, and it's time for some feedback and last 10%. And in this case, I was my own, supervisor and lead because I was working by myself. But I did ask my friends for some critiques, and so it was really important to bring this guy, to life. And another important thing is, did you archive your file? Make sure that you archive your file, because I've lost many projects the past years just because I forgot to archive. And yeah, just make sure you archive your file. And thank you. So this is the first part. And now I'm going to jump into Mari and show you two different workflows, the layer-based workflow and the node graph workflow. Okay, so now we are here in Mari, and the first project I want to show you is the layer version of Leviathan. So this is the version that I actually worked on when I completed Leviathan. I worked completely in layers at the time, and again, it worked fine. It's pretty efficient, especially when you work with shared layers. Again, one of the most important things is to keep things organized as much as you can with names, so you know where things are going. Because here, as you can see, I have a channel called resources. So let's open this down here. And then I have all my baked curvatures. And I'm pressing I right now, so I can change and look through the current paint target. You can see all the different curvatures that I baked and I imported. And so before I started painting anything, I just brought in all of my resources, all these occlusions, all these curvatures, the thickness. I just added into this channel, so whenever I needed that, I could just bring that in. That's part of the mise en place method that I talked about in the previous presentation. And if we go to our diffuse channel, you can see that I also used some ISO masks. So these are the isolation masks that I talked about. I created these masks. I isolated each material before I even start painting. This is like preparing for the painting process. And then later on, let's say if I wanted to work on my white metal in my diffuse, like here, for example, anything I dropped into this folder, it would be completely isolated by this mask ISO white metal. So let me just turn off these other ones. I'm just going to keep the white metal on right now. And let's say if you want to add let's say you want this one to be white metal. If you update that mask now by filling it white, look at that. That's part of the white metal now. Look how easy that is. If I want to, okay, I want this to be white metal as well. So let's fill that mask with white. Boom, white. The other thing you have to keep in mind is previously I had these patches into a different mask ISO. So you just have to make sure to go back and find where you had that and then make it black so it blocks in there. So when you turn everything on, yeah, so this setup worked super well for me. But I think the main thing was keeping it very super organized and consistent. Same thing with the names. Again, I have a bit of OCD when it comes to names, but you don't have to go that crazy with this. But at least putting some basic names like, oh, this is a basic color, this is a breakup. That's going to help a lot of people, especially if you're working on a project. And yeah, so here I'm just going to show you my thought process of the white metal, which is, I think, is one that was quite interesting. So I just started with a base color. Then I had just a tileable to add some breakup. Just have this, I'm just pressing L right now to access this image viewer. So I just added one of these textures. It's really good to have a library like this one with black and white stencils. You can create yourself from textures that you download or download a package. There's a lot of good packages online with overlays and things like that. So I just added that to add like some color variation. Again, looking at your reference, right? Here you can barely see that variation, but it's just good to not have a flat color. So after adding my breakup, I had a broad variation, which is basically I had my occlusion with some levels and a breakup texture on top of it. And then I had a second broad variation with my thickness, and just using an HSV, which uses the color below, and then you just adjust the hue and saturation a bit. But as you can see, the color by itself, it's pretty plain and pretty basic. But as soon as you go and you add the damage, this is I have the damage on top of here of everything. That's when you bring that to life, right? Again, it's super simple. There's not a lot of complexity, but when you put things together, it just makes sense. And that's why I spend a lot of time developing the mask where with some stencils. Here are some stencils that I used to add that kind of detail. Some painted metal. And I just projected them in those areas in some specific places. And again, if we look at other parts, again, they're pretty much the same, like especially things like the brass. I just added some grunge breakup to it, but most of the detail came from the spec. Got some color variation in my spec color there. And same thing with the gloss. When we put all these maps together, and as you can see here on the side, there's not a lot on each material. Like, of course, this the complexity will depend a lot, but I only have a tileable and a layer with some broad variation and some painted stuff. But for this asset, and specifically, most of the detail came from my damage masks that added the complexity that I wanted on Leviathan. So yeah, so this is an overview of the layer. Again, I used layers for many years, and I was happy with layers until I fell in love with nodes. And it's actually funny because I neglected nodes for the longest time. I had friends telling me to go and try nodes, and I always said no. Layers is the way to go, and nodes, it's never gonna catch on. Nobody's gonna use it. And now I'm here talking about nodes. And that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to close this guy. Oh, before I close, I just want to show you how my node graph looks right now. So if I open here, my node graph, it's down there. Brace yourselves. Look at that. It's just a mess because every time you create a layer here, this layer is also being created in your node graph. So that's how Mari always worked. Like they always had the node graph in the background. That's why sometimes it's not a good idea to work with both systems at the same time. I would rather choose one or the other. Okay? Okay, everyone. So I have my node version of Leviathan here. And just want to start showing you this mockup workflow that I created. So I just imported the maps that I had. Obviously, I didn't work with the nodes on this project, like I said, but I just imported the maps here so you would see how it would work on this project if I had started with nodes instead of layers. Before we look at the node graph down here, I just want to talk a little bit about this new feature that is in the new Mari 4.6. Which is the GeoChannel. If you open your Objects tab and you go down, there's an option here called GeoChannel Properties. And down here, as you can see, I have all these maps already. And all of that are maps that I imported into Mari, and I transformed them into GeoChannels. I can access them at any time. I'm going to create a new GeoChannel. You're going to see that I have in my node properties here, I have all the same GeoChannels that I have up there. Let's say if you want to import something, you can create a new channel by clicking on this plus button, and then you see GeoChannel 1 down here. Let's say if you want to add a new curvature B, you can just click on this button. It's going to open this dialog, and then you can search a curvature and import, and then you're going to have it ready for you. Another way you can do it, as you can see it here, to turn this ISO mask brass into a GeoChannel, you can easily right-click there, go to Export Flatten, and then Export Flatten to GeoChannel. So that's going to allow you to add this channel into your list, and then you can access it anytime you want, right? So that's the first thing I would do, just like create all the maps that I might need, like all my occlusions, my curvatures, and then just add them to my GeoChannels. And down here, you can see that these are all the channels. This is what I have here. So I have all my isolation masks ready. And on the side, I also have some of my auxiliary maps here. So if I want to access this thickness somewhere else, I can just create a GeoChannel and then search for thickness. So if you press 1 and view through that, you're going to see that it's the same one. That's the first thing I would do before I even start this, the main channels and masks down there. And then I would start creating my masks. Of course, in this case, I only have one layer because I just imported that into a paint layer down here. But in an actual project, you would see a lot of layers here. Some of you might be asking, like, why the nodes in Mari, they look like Nuke? Because some people might be used to the nodes in Mari being horizontal, and the reason is I feel more comfortable with this look. But if you want, you can press Shift S, and then you can turn these nodes into the Mari version, which is horizontal. The thing is, if I create a new channel now, new node, it would still look like Nuke. So if you want to change that, you can go to Preferences, and then Node Graph, and then change it to Show Port List. And here I just created a quick mock-up on how I would develop my channel. Let's say my diffuse, like I just created a quick diffuse here. So I started from the top. Down here I have my channel node. As you can see, I just created this channel node. And it starts from the top. I know this might sound super confusing for those who never used nodes in Mari or never seen nodes before. But don't worry, I'm planning on creating a set of tutorials for those who are transitioning from layers to nodes. So keep tuned on my social media. I'll let you guys know as soon as I finish developing something. So, okay, back to it. I just started with again, just like with my layers, I started with a base color, and then I added an HSV node on that color. And then here, this is my mask. Just plug that into, which is pretty much a geochannel with my thickness map. And then I use some levels in it to invert. I'm just going to my node properties here. And then I just have just a cloud with some levels. And I just changed my blending mode to overlay. Okay, I'm using that as a mask. And when you put it together, it's just a little bit of variation here. If you change the HSV, it's just like a subtle variation with that thickness. And then down here, I just added my wear with a darker color. As you can see, I just use a geochannel again to access that mask wear that I imported there. And I use this just to isolate my white metal. And then I will keep going down with the other materials. Okay? This might seem super confusing for a lot of you guys. But again, I'm planning on creating a set of tutorials to help you transition from the layer workflow into the nodes. And another thing that is pretty awesome about this node system workflow is that if you're working in a project with a team, it's super easy for you to export. Let's say you created this awesome mask dust and you want to share with your friends. It's as easy as you can imagine. So if you just select that, right-click, File, Export Nodes, and you export this somewhere. Just gonna export that as test. So I just exported that, and then now I'm gonna go to File, Import Nodes, and I'm gonna bring that in. Your friend can import that and have the same mask dust that you have. So it's great for modular workflows. And as you can see, it's super clean and it's easy to see where things are going. And I would highly recommend you adopt this workflow as soon as you can. And again, it doesn't matter that the layers, I'm not saying that the layer system is bad. I'm just saying that I learned that the node graph can be extremely useful and can make you extra productive in your production workflow. Okay? And thank you for joining me today. See ya.